Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the old world. Today let's talk about force organisation. Now it's something I think we're all going to be pretty familiar with. After all, certainly from a old world perspective, it's the force organisation chart, which tells us we've got to pay 25% of our points, so 500 points in a standard 2,000 point game on stuff we don't necessarily want in the form of core. And it also tells us about some of the other taxes we have to pay in order to bring models we actually want to field to the table. So for orcs and goblins, for example, if we want to take night goblins, we've got to take that black night goblin character. We want to take a black orc war boss, we've got to have a mob of black orc infantry for a grand composition army. But there is more to it than simply saying there's taxes involved. Now, obviously, for Warhammer the Old World, the point of force composition rules are to try and balance the game somewhat. It's to stop us having entirely free choice and being able to bring the most ridiculous broken combinations possible. Now, sometimes these rules do hurt a little bit. As an Empire player, I would love to be able to bring 2 steam tanks to the field, especially as other players, High Elves for example, can bring 2 dragons. But I suppose it does stop it being a free-for-all. But I don't think we should look at force composition purely as a negative. And actually, there are some really positive narrative elements around use of force composition charts. Why so? Well, if you have an army which complies to being a particular style, it looks like that army should do, and it gives us a better grounding in the narrative of the game. Let's face it, Warhammer, it's not a models, background, etc. agnostic game. It's set in a quite defined place of the Warhammer world, and it's a game that's had 40 years of, in fact, over 40 years of work put into expanding the narrative. There's all sorts of books out there covering all sorts of different stories, bits of information, talking about the geography, etc., etc. So it makes sense that you want to ground the forces in this setting. Now, this does, I think, make more sense for some armies when compared to others. If we look at the Empire, for example, or Bretonia, even the dwarves, high elves, things like that, armies that have a bit of structure behind them, they're not just going to be a mass medley, they're going to be put together with a little bit of purpose. Yes, there will be some random odds and sods floating around, but an Empire commander with a largely professional force is going to have an army that contains an element of balance. It's not just pulling together all the local militias and finding out that you've only got archers. For Bretonians, yes, you're going to have a different type of organisation, but if we look back at the high medieval period in Western Europe, as much as we think armies were a free-for-all, there was a structure here. Knights were supposed to bring a certain amount of men to the table. That's kind of how it was meant to work. So you would have a breakdown. If you look at the Italian wars and how armies came together, particularly the mercenary companies, there was structure. There were the 3-man pods of knight, of squire, of archer, or crossbowman, making sure that there was an all-arms combination and the army could operate in a number of different ways depending on the circumstances. Yes, other forces like orcs and goblins, Skaven, are perhaps more likely to be a bit of a pell-mell of random stuff, certainly chaos. Although actually, when I say that, there is an element of organisation within the Skaven ranks, so it's not going to be as wildly chaotic as a Beastman force, for example. And this carries through, I think, to other Games Workshop games as well, things like Warhammer 40,000. So I've done a couple of videos on a current project where I'm slowly building an Imperial Guard force for the 11th edition, and Actually, I'm leaning quite heavily into force organisation. It's something that really seems to make sense to me when talking about the Imperial Guard. In fact, if we look back at earlier editions of Warhammer 40,000, they had a much more restrictive force organisation chart than they do now. So if you wanted infantry, rather than just being able to say, oh, one of those, one of those, you had to take organised platoons. So you needed a platoon command, you needed to then take a certain number of regular infantry platoons, you could take then heavy weapon squads which attached to that, and it really gave it semblance of a modern, structured, armed force. And actually, as part of that project, I've actually leaned more into the restrictive organisation chart than the regular rules of 10th edition would require me to do so. To help me out, I have drawn from history. And let's face it, an awful lot of Warhammer does draw its influences from things that actually happened. And as I'm doing an Imperial Guard, themed Imperial Guard army, I'm actually basing the structure of my infantry elements on the way that a French World War II infantry unit would have been created. So I've had to do a little bit of jiggery pokery because the numbers don't quite line up to the rules of 10th edition. So no neat 10-man squads here. Heavy weapon squads, they live separately in the way that French units at the time were organised, rather than being slapped at that sort of platoon level that the previous editions of Imperial Guard had. But it does really help me feel as though I'm grounding my force in a story, in a narrative, and that will hopefully help me to gain a greater level of enjoyment from the game. So what do you think? Do you think that force composition is something of value? Do you think it can add that narrative grounding? Or is it merely a frustration that stops you taking the things you want to take? And actually, do you believe that it just generates further imbalance in the game? Maybe taking that only one steam tank against double dragon as an example. Do let me know what you think down in the comments below. All that remains for me to say is I hope this has been a little bit thought-provoking around maybe some of the benefits of having force organisation and how actually being even more restrictive on yourself can be of benefits to the overall enjoyment. As always, I am returned to the old world. Have a great day.